complex and sophisticated machine ever made. In 6 minutes, it will be traveling at 17,500 miles an hour. In 8 minutes, the humans inside will no longer feel the pull of the Earth's gravity. When the 20th century started, humans couldn't even fly. As it ends, they're flying where no creature has ever flown, and they do it with rockets. Rockets aren't new. Neither is the idea of riding them to the heavens. One night in the 16th century, a Chinese nobleman, Wan Hu, prepared himself for liftoff. But then there was, as modern spacemen say, a glitch. And though Wan Hu didn't make it to the stars, he couldn't be found on the face of the Earth either. For 400 years more, spaceflight was confined to dreams and rockets to fireworks. But this century saw rockets take a deadly trajectory. It was alcohol, not gunpowder, that propelled Germany's infamous V-2s to London, but the principle was the same.
A rocket is essentially a high-tech version of a hot air balloon. A hot air balloon in the sense of a child's balloon. What a rocket does is have a barely contained explosion to generate high-pressure, high-temperature gas that's contained in a cavity. And that gas then squirts out at very high speed out a little hole, but it's still a barely contained explosion.
Sounds simple, but in their post-war rocketry, both Americans and Soviets found that containing the explosions was the tricky part. The US and the Soviets were caught up in a space race. Both wanted to be the first to put a human in orbit. And in 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to leave the planet. He had ridden into space on top of the powerful Vostok rocket, and he hadn't been blown to bits. The US reacted to the setback by concentrating on a new race. A race to the moon. They had the technology, the urgency, and the money. At the Kennedy Space Center, they built a vehicle assembly building, so large that a 45-story office building could fit through its doorway. The moon rockets would be carried from there to the launch tower on the world's largest land vehicle. Everything to do with moon rockets was colossal. The 360-foot-high engine test stand at Huntsville, Alabama, has more concrete in it than the Great Pyramid has stone. In 1960, when 5 Saturn engines were tested at the same time, the roar could be heard 100 miles away. All that power was needed. The ship that was going to be lifted off the planet, the Saturn V, was longer than a football field and weighed as much as 30 locomotives. The Soviets, of course, had blueprints for a moon rocket of their own. After all, the race was still on. But while the Americans were open about their space program, the Soviets were clandestine. But that just heightened the interest for C.P. Vick, amateur space detective. Vick had no connection with the U.S. government at all, and certainly no access to spy satellites. But that didn't stop him. He used images from Landsat, the NASA Earth Resources satellite, to find details of rockets that he could barely see. Using only material in the public domain, he became an international authority on the Soviet space program, and drew the N-1 moon rocket long before the official drawings were released. And the drawings he made, which took weeks because of all the calculations he had to do, contained a lot of educated guesswork, but they were good enough.
My drawings were published in the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Space Technology in 1981. This was put on display in Moscow at a book fair, which many Russian rocket scientists visited. Subsequently, they ordered many copies of it. But at the time, they were saying in so many terms that I knew a little bit more than I needed to know. But ultimately, in recent years, we have actually been able to see what the launch vehicle looks like, as we can see over here. N-1 was a monster launch vehicle producing over 10 million pounds of thrust.
This is the first film ever shown publicly of the N-1 in flight. The Soviets planned to put a man on the moon a year before the 1969 U.S. Apollo landing. And here's the reason they didn't. They could never get all 30 of its first stage engines to work together. The N-1 may not have flown very well, but it was the biggest rocket ever to try to fly. It had 5 stages compared to Saturn's 3. But Saturn worked, and the N-1 didn't, because Saturn was simpler. Not that simple, though.
0. Ignition. Liftoff. Liftoff. 30 minutes after the hour.
It takes a top speed of 25,000 miles an hour to fly to the moon. If you're in a hurry to make a rocket ship that will do that, the quickest way, though not the most economical, is to make one that burns in stages. Make 3 rocket ships. When the first one has used up its fuel, it simply drops off. That leaves the second one with a much lighter load to push. The spacecraft goes faster, and then the second stage drops away. Then the third engine fires, slings the ship around the Earth, and shoots it towards the moon. And so the age-old dream of humankind came true. But dreams that come true can often be followed by a feeling of anticlimax. Almost as soon as the astronauts were there, the media and politicians began to wonder if the trips had been worth all the money. And after 17 Apollo missions, the last of which wasn't even shown on television, the not quite finished rockets meant for the next series were just left lying on the ground. And then, in 1996, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, worried that the rockets might rust away, decided to save one for history and put it in the Kennedy Center's Space Museum. Saturn is an awesome machine, and in the museum, a possible inspiration to future interplanetary travelers. But since it was last used in the early 70s, rocketry has been refined. Most rockets don't need to be nearly this huge anymore. Rockets are mainly business now. Slimmer, more cost-effective machines, built to carry useful, profitable satellites into stationary orbits. Orbits timed to move with the rotation of the Earth, so that the effect is to hang still in the sky.